38 seconds. That is all the time that passed between the two largest earthquakes Venezuela has felt in modern memory, a magnitude 7.2, and then, before the dust had even begun to settle, a magnitude 7.5, striking almost the same patch of ground near the cities of the north. It is the kind of double event that seismologists see maybe once in a generation, and it left buildings folded into the street. But the part that has people genuinely unsettled is not the earthquake itself. It is what was happening 93 million miles away, in the very same hour, and the claim that the two might not be a coincidence at all. If this channel is where you come to understand what is really happening above and beneath us, subscribe to the Sky Lab, because this story is still unfolding. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and whether you felt anything where you are. Now, let us get into it. Part 1. The 38 seconds that broke northern Venezuela. At 4 minutes past 10 at night, Universal Time on the 24th of June, 2026, the ground beneath the hills near a town called Umare in northern Venezuela tore open. It was a magnitude 7.2 earthquake, and on its own, that would have been the largest story on the planet for days. A magnitude 7.2 is not a tremor. It is the kind of release that drops bridges, that folds the lower floors of apartment buildings into the ones beneath them, that turns a normal evening into the worst night of tens of thousands of lives. And in most versions of this story, that is where it would end. One catastrophic earthquake, one grieving region, one long recovery. But that is not what happened. Because 38 seconds later, before the dust from the first rupture had even begun to settle, before a single person who had survived the first shock had time to understand what was happening to them, the ground moved again, and this time it was bigger. A magnitude 7.5, even shallower, even more violent, struck almost the exact same patch of earth. 2 major earthquakes, back to back, in less than a minute, in the same place. Seismologists have a clean, almost clinical word for this. They call it a doublet. There is nothing clean about what it does to a city. You have to understand how rare this is to appreciate how strange the night of June 24th really was. Major earthquakes, the genuine monsters above magnitude 7, happen on the order of 15 times in an entire year across the whole surface of the planet. To get 2 of them, within seconds of each other, in the same location, is the kind of event that earthquake scientists will be studying and writing papers about for years. And it happened near cities. The epicenters sat only about 150 kilometers west of Caracas, the Venezuelan capital, and far closer than that to Valencia and Maracay, 2 of the largest cities in the entire country, home together to millions of people. When the second quake hit, both ruptures were less than 20 kilometers below the surface. Some readings put the larger one at only 10 kilometers down. That is the cruelest possible depth. A deep earthquake spreads its energy out through the planet before it ever reaches the people on top of it. A shallow one delivers almost everything it has straight up, into the floors and the walls and the foundations of whatever happens to be standing above. And things were standing above. That is the part that made the first hours of this event so frightening to watch unfold in real time. As the night went on, images began moving across the internet of buildings that no longer looked like buildings. Multi-story structures pancaked into rubble, streets buried, the kind of footage that makes your stomach drop because you know instantly that people were inside. Last night, watching it happen, the honest fear among everyone following along was that this was a disaster on the scale of thousands of deaths, maybe many thousands. When 2 7-magnitude earthquakes strike a populated region 40 seconds apart, that fear is not paranoia, it is arithmetic. And yet, by the time morning came, the picture had shifted in a way that deserves to be said clearly and gratefully. The reported toll of dead and injured, while serious, while a tragedy for every family it touched, had not come close to the worst projections from the night before. It had not reached into the thousands the way those first collapsed buildings suggested it might. Cleanup was already underway, rescues were happening, and while it would be obscene to call any version of this a good outcome, it is fair and it is human to feel relief that the very worst case did not arrive. The people of northern Venezuela took a blow that could have erased entire neighborhoods, and far more of them are still here this morning than the footage of last night had any right to promise. So if that were the whole story, it would already be enough. the most catastrophic earthquake event in years, a true geological rarity striking near major cities and somehow leaving behind far fewer dead than it could have. That alone would be worth sitting down and understanding. But that is not why you are here, and it is not why this video exists, because the earthquake, as enormous as it was, is only half of what happened on the night of the 24th. There is a second thread to this night, and it runs 93 million miles away, and when you lay the two threads side by side, you get a question that a growing number of people are asking out loud, and that mainstream science has spent a long time trying very hard not to answer. Here is that question stated plainly, so you know exactly where we are going. At almost the precise moment that the ground was failing in Venezuela, the Earth was being hit by a storm from the Sun. A stream of fast solar wind pouring out of a hole in the Sun's atmosphere slammed into our planet and roughly doubled in speed in the very same window of hours that those quakes struck. And there is a body of research, controversial, contested, but real, that argues the Sun can do more than light our sky and disrupt our satellites. It argues the Sun can, under the right conditions, help shake the ground. The terrifying implication in the title of this video is not that an earthquake happened. Earthquakes always happen. The terrifying implication is the possibility that this one, and the others that struck the planet the same night, were not entirely random, that something above us may have been involved. I want to be honest with you from the very first minute, because that is the only way this channel is worth your time. I'm not going to tell you that the Sun caused this earthquake. By the end of this, I'm going to show you why the most careful reading of the evidence points somewhere very different, and why the real warning hiding in this night is not the one most people are reaching for. But I'm also not going to wave the question away, the way a lot of coverage does, with a quick laugh and a change of subject. Because the question is better than its worst advocates, and the data from the 24th of June is genuinely strange enough to deserve a serious, careful, eyes-open look. That is the thread that runs through everything we are about to do. The ground moved in a way that should terrify us. The Sun was active in the same window. And the truth of how those two facts relate to each other turns out to matter far more than a simple yes or no. Let me set the stage properly before we climb toward the Sun, because the Venezuela earthquake itself is not a footnote on the way to a space weather story. It is the spine of this entire night, and you cannot judge the strange coincidence at the centre of this until you understand exactly what the ground did and why. So stay with me here on solid Earth for a while. We're going to walk through what actually ruptured beneath Yumare, why two giant earthquakes can fire within a single breath of each other, why this particular stretch of northern Venezuela was always, quietly, one of the most dangerous places in the hemisphere to build a city, and why the warning signs were there long before anyone was looking at the Sun. Because that phrase, "we were warned," is going to come back again and again before we are done, and by the end you are going to understand that it is true in at least two completely different ways, and that the version most people are afraid of may not be the one that should actually keep us up at night. The ground gave us a warning written in stone and history, decades and even centuries old, and the sky, right now, this week, is writing us a second warning that is far more concrete than any solar earthquake theory. Both of those warnings converged on a single night. Let us start with the one beneath our feet. Think about what it actually means for two faults, or two pieces of one fault, to fail 38 seconds apart. When the first earthquake released, it did not simply discharge its own stored energy and stop. It shoved. An earthquake is, at its core, a sudden slip along a fracture in the crust, and when that slip happens, it changes the pressure on every piece of rock nearby. Some of that surrounding rock gets relaxed, but some of it gets squeezed harder, loaded more, pushed closer to its own breaking point. If a neighbouring stretch of fault was already near failure, already holding centuries of accumulated strain, that sudden extra shove from the first quake can be the final push that sends it over the edge. We are going to come back to that idea of a final push, because it is going to matter enormously when we get to the Sun, but on the ground, in Venezuela, that is almost certainly what happened. One rupture triggered its neighbour, and the planet hit a region full of sleeping cities with two hammer blows instead of one. And here is what should sit with you as we move forward. Nobody got a warning. There was no alert the morning of the 24th telling the people of Yaracuy and Carabobo that the most violent night in their region's modern history was hours away. The fault did not announce itself. It simply waited. the way these faults always wait, holding its strain in silence for decades until the precise moment it chose to let go. That silence, that total absence of warning from a system capable of this much destruction, is the real horror at the foundation of this story. And it is the thing we're going to weigh, again and again, against the claim that the sun was sending signals all along. Part 2. Anatomy of a double rupture. To understand why two giant earthquakes can fire within the same breath, you have to throw out the cartoon version of an earthquake that most of us carry around in our heads. In that cartoon, an earthquake is a single dot on a map, a one-time bang, a moment when the ground shakes and then is finished. The reality is closer to a tear ripping through fabric. When a fault fails, the rupture does not happen everywhere at once. It begins at a point, and then it races along the fault line, sometimes for tens or even hundreds of kilometers, peeling the two sides of the fracture apart as it goes. The energy you feel as shaking is the sound, in a sense, of that tear propagating through solid rock at thousands of kilometers per hour. Now hold that picture in your mind and add the crucial detail. The rock around a fault is not a passive bystander. It is under pressure. It has been squeezed and loaded for decades or centuries by the slow, relentless grinding of the planet's outer shell. The crust of the Earth is broken into enormous slabs, the tectonic plates, and those plates are always moving, never more than a few centimeters a year, about as fast as your fingernails grow, but never stopping. Where two of those plates meet, the rock at the boundary is caught in the middle, locked in place by friction, while the plates keep trying to move. Strain builds, and builds, and builds. For a human lifetime, nothing visible happens. Then, in a matter of seconds, the friction loses, the lock breaks, and all that stored strain releases at once. That release is the earthquake. So when the first rupture tore through the crust near Umare, releasing a magnitude 7.2, it did something more than just discharge its own energy. It rearranged the stress on everything around it. Picture a row of people leaning hard against a long, heavy door, all of them straining, all of them holding it shut. Now one of them suddenly steps away. The load they were carrying does not vanish. It gets redistributed onto everyone still pushing. The people on either side of the one who stepped away feel the burden jump. If any of them were already at their limit, that sudden extra weight is exactly what sends them stumbling. That, in the language of physics rather than metaphor, is what seismologists call stress transfer, and it is one of the best understood phenomena in all of earthquake science. When the magnitude 7.2 released near Umare, it transferred stress onto the rock around it. A neighbouring stretch of the fault system, already loaded near its own failure point, got that sudden additional push, and it failed. 38 seconds later, a magnitude 7.5 let go. The reason the two events came so impossibly close together in time is not mysterious at all once you understand the mechanism. The first quake did not have to wait years to load its neighbour. The neighbour was already loaded. The first quake simply delivered the last little increment of stress instantly, and the second rupture followed almost immediately. One earthquake triggered another earthquake. This happens. It is documented. It is physically understood, and I want you to hold on tightly to that idea, because in a few parts from now, when we get to the claim about the sun, the entire argument is going to come down to one question. What does it take to be the final push? Keep that question burning. It is the hinge this whole story turns on. Here is why the second quake being the larger of the two matters so much for the people who lived through it. In a normal sequence, you might get a large earthquake followed by smaller aftershocks, each one a little less violent than the last as the system settles. That is the pattern our instincts are built around. The big one hits, and then things get less bad. But a doublet breaks that expectation in the most brutal way possible. The people of northern Venezuela felt a magnitude 7.2, an apocalyptic event in its own right, and in the handful of seconds it took them to register that they were in the middle of a catastrophe. The planet hit them with something even stronger. Any structure weakened by the first shock, any wall already cracked, any column already buckling, met the second larger wave of energy while it was already failing. That is why the building collapses were so severe. It was not one earthquake, it was two, and the worst one came second, into a landscape already broken. The depth made it worse still. I mentioned that the ruptures were shallow, somewhere between 10 and 20 kilometers below the surface, with the larger event possibly as little as 10 kilometers down. Let me make concrete why that number is so devastating. When an earthquake happens far below the surface, say 300 or 500 kilometers deep, and those do happen, the seismic energy has to travel through an enormous thickness of rock before it reaches the people on top. Along that journey, the energy spreads out and weakens, the way a shout fades as it crosses a canyon. By the time it arrives at the surface, even a very large deep earthquake may produce only moderate shaking, but a shallow earthquake gives its energy almost no distance to weaken. The rupture is right there, just beneath the foundations, and it delivers nearly its full violence directly into the built world above. A shallow magnitude 7.5 is, for the people standing over it, about as bad as the Earth gets. And notice what was absent from this entire sequence. There was no foreshock pattern that anyone could have read as a clear warning. There was no swarm of small tremors in the days before that authorities could have pointed to and said, "Evacuate! This is coming." The fault held its silence right up until the instant it failed, and then it failed twice. This is the uncomfortable truth at the centre of earthquake science that we would all rather not sit with. We can map the faults, we can measure the strain, we can say, with real confidence, that a given fault is dangerous and is capable of a major earthquake and is, in the long run, overdue. What we cannot do, what no one on Earth can do today, is tell you the day. The fault near Yumari was known. The danger was understood. The timing was a complete surprise. Remember that, because the claim we are building toward is, in part, a claim that the timing was not a surprise at all, that there was a signal written in the solar wind for anyone willing to read it. There is one more feature of this rupture that matters, and it connects directly to a detail we will need when we compare Venezuela to Japan. The Venezuela earthquakes happened on what is called a strike-slip fault system. That is a specific kind of fault, the same basic type as the famous one that runs through California, where two blocks of crust grind past each other horizontally, sliding sideways rather than one diving beneath the other. This matters for a very practical reason that played out on the night of the 24th. Strike-slip earthquakes on land with sideways motion generally do not lift or drop the seafloor, and so they generally do not generate large tsunamis. And indeed, despite the violence of these quakes, no tsunami was triggered. The tsunami flag on the official reports read 0. For the coastal communities of the Caribbean, that was one mercy in a merciless night. But file away that phrase, strike-slip horizontal motion, because when we get to Japan, we are going to find an earthquake driven by a completely different mechanism on a completely different kind of fault, and that contrast is going to become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire solar question. So step back and hold the whole picture of what the ground did. A mature, heavily loaded strike-slip boundary near major Venezuelan cities reached its breaking point. The first rupture transferred its stress to a neighbouring segment already on the edge, and that segment failed 38 seconds later with even greater force. Both ruptures were shallow, delivering nearly their full energy into a populated region. No meaningful warning preceded them, and the only reason the death toll did not climb into the thousands was some combination of luck, building survival, and the timing within the structures themselves. Everything about this so far is explainable entirely by the physics of the Earth itself. No sun required. The doublet is rare, but it is not supernatural. It is what a loaded fault does when one piece breaks and shoves its neighbour over the edge. There is a way scientists study these stress transfers after the fact, and it is worth understanding because it shows how well grasped this process really is. After a major earthquake, researchers map out the pattern of where the stress increased and where it decreased around the rupture, and they call these maps of the resulting stress changes. What they find, again and again, is that the aftershocks and the triggered ruptures cluster precisely in the zones where the first earthquake added stress, and they go quiet in the zones where the first earthquake relieved it. The pattern is so consistent that it has become one of the workhorses of modern seismology. So when a magnitude 7.2 is immediately followed by a magnitude 7.5 on a neighbouring segment, scientists do not throw up their hands in confusion. They recognise a textbook case of one rupture loading and releasing its neighbour. The Venezuela doublet, rare as it is in its size and its closeness, is not a mystery to the people who study faults. It is the most natural thing in the world for an earthquake to push on the rock around it, and for that rock, if it was already near failure, to break. There is also the matter of how the rupture travelled, which shapes who suffers most. When a fault tears, it usually tears in a preferred direction, racing along the fault line one way more than the other, and the ground in the path of that racing rupture gets hit harder than the ground behind it, because the energy piles up ahead of the tear like the bunching of a wave. This is called directivity, and it means that two cities the same distance from an epicenter can experience wildly different shaking depending on which way the rupture ran. For northern Venezuela, the specific direction these ruptures travelled helped determine which towns took the worst of it, and which were partly spared, and in the days and weeks ahead, seismologists will reconstruct exactly that, working out the path of each tear from the records of seismometers around the world. None of that reconstruction will need to invoke anything beyond the Earth. The instruments will tell a complete story of rock breaking rock, of one rupture shoving the next, of energy racing in a particular direction through a particular slice of crust. The account will be whole, and it will be terrestrial. And that completeness is the thing I keep returning to, because it is the foundation everything else rests on. When a phenomenon can be fully explained by the forces already known to be present, the bar for invoking a new exotic force becomes very high. We do not reach for an outside influence to explain the second quake, because the first quake explains it perfectly. We do not reach for the sun to explain the doublet, because stress transfer explains the doublet completely. This is not closed-mindedness. It is the ordinary economy of explanation that all of science runs on. You add new causes only when the known causes fail, and here, the known causes do not fail. They account for every second of what happened beneath Yumare. Hold that standard in your mind, because when we get to the sun, we are going to apply exactly the same test and ask whether there is anything left over that the Earth alone cannot explain. And that is exactly the point we have to be honest about before we look up. The Earth, all by itself, is fully capable of producing this night. We do not need to invoke anything from space to explain a strike-slip boundary, failing twice in 40 seconds near Yumare. So when we turn to the sun in the coming parts, we are not turning to it because the earthquake demands an explanation the Earth cannot provide. We are turning to it because of a coincidence in time, a coincidence that a lot of people find impossible to ignore and that the data, frustratingly, refuses to make simple. The ground has given us its account, and its account is complete on its own terms. Now we have to ask whether the sky was also writing in the margins. But first, we need to understand why this exact stretch of northern Venezuela was a disaster waiting to happen long before this week, long before anyone tied it to the sun at all. Part 3. The fault that was always going to do this. If you want to understand why northern Venezuela shook the way it did, you have to meet the fault that did it. Running roughly east to west across the top of the country, just inland from the Caribbean coast, is a system of fractures in the crust that marks one of the great boundaries of the planet. This is where the Caribbean plate and the South American plate meet, and they do not meet gently. The Caribbean plate is sliding eastward relative to South America, grinding past it, and that motion is carried by a family of faults with names that the rest of the world rarely hears until a night like this one. The San Sebastian Fault, the El Pilar Fault. These are the sideways grinding strike-slip faults we talked about, and they run, with terrible precision, right through the most heavily populated belt of Venezuela. Think about what that means geographically. The biggest cities of the country, Caracas, Valencia, Maracay, and the dense corridor of towns between them, are not located safely away from this plate boundary. They are sitting almost directly on top of it, strung out along the very seam where two pieces of the Earth's shell are scraping past each other. This is not unusual, sadly. Throughout human history, people have built their greatest cities exactly where the land is most geologically active, because the same forces that build faults also build harbours, valleys, and fertile ground. But it means that when this boundary moves, it does not move out in some empty stretch of ocean or desert. It moves under millions of people. The fault near Yumare that failed on the 24th of June is part of this same restless system, and the cities it threatened were never far away. Now here is the part that should make the hair stand up on your arms, and it has nothing to do with the sun. This is not the first time this fault family has done something like this. Reach back more than 2 centuries to the 26th of March, 1812. On that day, a catastrophic earthquake struck this same region of northern Venezuela, devastating Caracas and other towns. The estimates of the dead from that 1812 disaster run into the many thousands, with some accounts placing the toll near 20,000 people in a country with a far smaller population than today. It struck by a grim accident of the calendar on a holy day when churches were full, and many of those churches came down on the people inside them. The 1812 earthquake is burned into the history of Venezuela. And it was produced by the same kind of motion, on the same kind of fault, in the same dangerous belt as the doublet of this week. So when I say the fault was always going to do this, I am not speaking loosely. I am telling you that the historical record, written in the rubble of 1812 and reinforced by every measurement modern science has taken of this plate boundary since, said clearly that northern Venezuela was capable of a major deadly earthquake, and that it was only ever a question of when. The strain was accumulating. The plates never stopped moving. The fault was loaded. Geologists could and did identify this as a hazardous zone. Every ingredient for catastrophe was sitting in plain sight for anyone who cared to look at the maps and the history. And this is the first, oldest, and in some ways most important sense in which we were warned. The Earth had already told us 214 years ago exactly what this region could do. We simply cannot keep that warning sharp in our minds across the span of generations. A danger that arrives once every century or two slips out of living memory. The people who felt 1812 were gone long before this week. The warning was in the books, not in anyone's bones. This is the tragedy that runs underneath all earthquake science, and it is worth saying slowly because it frames everything that follows. We are very good at knowing where. We are completely unable to know when. Seismologists can hand you a map of the world's most dangerous fault zones and they will be right. They can tell you that this Venezuelan boundary, the California fault system, the subduction zones around Japan and Indonesia and Chile are loaded and dangerous and capable of horror. What they cannot do, what remains one of the genuine unsolved problems of the geosciences, is give you the date. There is no reliable earthquake forecast that says, this fault, this week. And because there is no such forecast, the warnings we do have, the maps, the history, the strain measurements, tend to sit ignored until the ground proves them right in the most painful way imaginable. And now you can begin to see why the solar earthquake idea has the pull that it has. Because what that idea offers, at its most seductive, is a solution to exactly this problem. It offers the possibility that there is a signal, a trigger, a knowable external cause that could tell us not just where but when. If solar storms could push loaded faults over the edge, then watching the sun could, in principle, give us the warning that the Earth itself refuses to provide. That is an enormously attractive promise. It speaks directly to the deepest frustration in the entire field, and I think that is a large part of why, every time a major earthquake happens to line up with active space weather, a wave of people seize on it as proof. They are not foolish for wanting it to be true. The desire for a warning system is one of the most human desires there is, especially when you have just watched buildings fall on families. We should hold on to that sympathy as we examine the claim, because the people asking this question are reaching for something genuinely good. The question is only whether the sun can actually deliver it. Before we leave the ground and finally turn our eyes upward, let me make sure the stakes of the Venezuela event are completely clear, because they anchor everything. This was, by a fair measure, the most catastrophic earthquake event the planet has produced in years. Not the single largest magnitude ever recorded, but the most catastrophic in the combination that actually matters: enormous energy, terrible shallowness, a doublet structure that hit twice, and a location nearly on top of major cities. It was the kind of event that, in a slightly different version of reality, with the buildings a little weaker or the timing a little different, could have killed tens of thousands. That it did not is a mercy worth being grateful for, but the capability was there. The fault demonstrated in front of the whole world that it can do this, and it can do it again, with no more warning than it gave this time, unless we learn to take the warnings we already have seriously. That is the ground's testimony, complete. A known, dangerous, historically proven fault system, running beneath major cities, reached its limit and failed twice in under a minute, shallow and violent, exactly as the geology and the history said it eventually would. Nothing about that requires the sky, and I want that to be settled in your mind, firmly, before we look up, because it changes how we have to interpret what comes next. We are not about to go searching the heavens for a cause the Earth cannot supply. The Earth supplies the cause completely. we are about to go searching the heavens because of something else entirely. A coincidence of timing so precise, so dramatic, that a great many people simply cannot accept that it means nothing. And honestly, neither should you, not without looking at it carefully first. So let us look. Because here is what was happening above our heads, in the same handful of hours that the ground was failing beneath Yumari. While the fault was doing exactly what 2 centuries of history predicted it would eventually do, the Earth was being struck by a storm that did not come from any plate or any fault. It came from the sun. And the people who have spent years arguing that our star can shake our world were watching the clock on the night of the 24th of June with a feeling very close to vindication. To understand why, we have to leave the crust behind, travel 93 million miles, and meet the second character in this story, a hole in the sun. Part 4. The other thing that happened that night. While the ground was failing in Venezuela, the Earth was sitting inside a storm from the sun. To understand that storm, you first have to understand that the sun is not a quiet, steady lamp hanging in the sky. It is a churning, magnetic, violent thing, and it is constantly blowing a wind of charged particles out into space in every direction. We call it the solar wind. It is always there, always streaming past us. A thin river of electrically charged gas flowing outward from the sun at hundreds of kilometers per second. On a normal day, the Earth's magnetic field deflects most of it, and we go about our lives completely unaware that we are standing in a perpetual gale blowing off our own star. But the solar wind is not uniform. It has fast lanes and slow lanes, and the fast lanes come from specific places. The most important of these for our story is something called a coronal hole. A coronal hole is a region in the sun's outer atmosphere, its corona, where the magnetic field, instead of looping back down onto the sun, opens up and reaches out into space like an open gate. Through that open gate, the solar wind escapes far more easily and far faster than it does elsewhere. When you look at the sun in the right wavelength of light, these coronal holes show up as enormous dark patches, gaping voids against the bright disk. And in the days before the 24th of June, there was a large one, described by observers as having a kind of double-lobed, whale-tailed shape, turning toward Earth and then beginning to rotate away. That coronal hole was the source of the storm. The high-speed stream of solar wind pouring out of it had been expected to reach Earth, and forecasters had been watching for it. What happened is that the stream arrived and the solar wind speed around our planet climbed sharply. A day earlier, the wind had been flowing at a fairly ordinary pace, somewhere around 350 kilometers per second. Then it began to step up. By the early hours of the 24th, it had risen toward 450 kilometers per second. And then, as the core of the stream washed over us, it accelerated further, reaching roughly 600 kilometers per second by the end of the day, with some readings of the surrounding plasma climbing even higher, towards 700. The wind from the sun, in other words, very nearly doubled in speed over the course of that day, and the steepest part of that rise happened in the evening hours, universal time. Hold that timing in your mind. The evening of the 24th universal time is exactly when the ground was failing. When a fast solar wind stream hits the Earth, it does not just blow harder. It can rattle the Earth's magnetic field, and whether it does depends on a subtle and crucial detail, the direction of the magnetic field carried within the solar wind itself. The solar wind drags a piece of the sun's magnetic field along with it, and that embedded field has an orientation. When its north-south component, which scientists label Béziers, points southward, it lines up against the Earth's own field in a way that lets the solar wind pour its energy into our magnetosphere with far greater efficiency. It is like two magnets meeting in the orientation that lets them latch together rather than push apart. On the night of the 24th, the embedded field did swing southward, with that Béziers component dropping to as much as 11 units below zero, in the negative direction that opens the door. The total strength of the field rose as well. The gate was open, the wind was fast, and the energy flowed in. The result was a geomagnetic storm. Now, I want to be precise and not oversell this, because precision is the whole point of this channel. The storm that resulted was a minor one. On the scale that space weather forecasters use, which runs from G1 at the bottom to G5 at the top, this reached G1, the lowest storm level. The planetary index that tracks geomagnetic disturbance the KP index, climbed to a value of 5, which is the threshold for that minor G1 storm, and it peaked in the early hours of the 25th universal time, a little after the earthquakes. Forecasters issued the routine alerts that come with a G1. At high latitudes, the aurora may have been pushed a little further south than usual. Weak fluctuations in power grids are possible at that level, and minor effects on satellites. By the standards of space weather, this was not a monster. It was a small, ordinary storm of the kind that happens many times a year when a coronal hole swings into view, and that right there is the first complication for anyone who wants to tie this storm to the earthquakes. The storm was real, but it was modest. If the claim is that powerful solar storms shake the Earth, then we have to grapple with the fact that this was not a powerful solar storm. It was a minor one. There have been vastly stronger geomagnetic storms in recent years, storms that lit the sky with aurora visible at tropical latitudes, and those did not coincide with global earthquake doublets. So if a minor G1 storm can supposedly help trigger a magnitude 7.5, why don't the far larger storms produce far more earthquakes? That is a question we will have to come back to, and it is a hard one for the hypothesis to answer. But let me not get ahead of the argument. For now, simply hold the facts. A coronal hole sent a fast stream. The solar wind nearly doubled in speed, peaking in the evening of the 24th. The embedded magnetic field turned southward. A minor geomagnetic storm followed. All of that is solid, measured, official data. None of it is in dispute. What is in dispute is what it means. Because there is a detail in the timing that the people who study the solar earthquake connection consider far more important than the storm's modest size. They point out that the major effect of an event like this is not just the dramatic geomagnetic storm that lights up the aurora. They argue that the more important coupling happens lower down, in a layer of the upper atmosphere called the ionosphere, the electrically charged shell that surrounds our planet and that connects in complex ways to the ground below. The argument goes that as the solar wind stream amplified, it disturbed this ionosphere, and that this lower atmosphere disturbance is the real channel through which solar activity might reach down and touch the crust. And the timing of that amplification, they emphasize, was not hours off from the earthquakes, it was right on top of them. Let me lay the clock out for you exactly, because the clock is the entire case. In the afternoon of the 24th universal time, there was already a significant earthquake, the magnitude 5.5 in Northern California. Then, in the evening, as the solar wind stream amplified hardest, the planet produced its cluster of major quakes within a single hour. Venezuela's doublet, the 7.2 and the 7.5, struck just after 2200 hours, 10 o'clock at night, universal time. And roughly 25 minutes after that, Japan was struck by its magnitude 6.9. 3 significant earthquakes on 3 different parts of the globe, all inside the same hour, an hour that fell squarely inside the window when the wind from the sun was surging to its peak. To someone who has spent years convinced that the sun forces the earth to shake, that clock does not look like coincidence. It looks like cause and effect, caught red-handed. It helps to slow down and understand what a coronal hole high-speed stream actually is, because the name sounds more frightening than the reality, and that gap between the name and the reality is itself part of the story. A coronal hole is not a wound in the sun. It is not an explosion. It is simply a region where the sun's magnetic field opens outward instead of looping back, and through that opening the ordinary solar wind escapes faster than usual. These holes are a routine feature of the sun, especially in the declining years of the solar cycle. They rotate around with the sun roughly every 27 days, and so the same hole can sweep its stream past Earth month after month, producing a familiar recurring pattern of minor disturbances that forecasters know well and predict with decent accuracy. The stream that arrived around the 24th was one of these recurring features, expected, ordinary, the kind of space weather that happens many times a year. That is worth holding on to because the language people reach for, a storm, a hole in the sun, plasma slamming into Earth, makes it sound like a singular cosmic assault, when in fact it was a common and well-understood event. The geomagnetic storm it produced is measured on a scale that runs from 1 to 5, and understanding where this one fell puts the whole night in proportion. At the bottom of the scale, a level 1 storm, the kind we had on the 24th, produces effects that are real but minor. Aurora may be pushed a little further from the poles than usual. sensitive equipment may register small fluctuations. Most people on Earth would never know it happened without instruments to tell them. At the top of the scale, a level 5 storm is a different animal entirely, capable of pushing aurora toward the tropics, disrupting power grids over whole regions, and seriously degrading satellite and radio systems. The history of space weather contains genuine monsters of this kind, storms so powerful they set telegraph lines sparking in earlier centuries and would threaten the backbone of modern technology if they struck today. The 24th was nothing like those. It was a gentle nudge of the magnetosphere, near the very bottom of the scale, the kind of event that comes and goes without consequence on almost every occasion it occurs. And that proportion is exactly what makes the earthquake claim so awkward when you examine it closely. If the proposition is that solar storms shake the Earth, then the strength of the storm ought to matter. A bigger storm should mean a bigger effect, more earthquakes, larger ones, a clearer signal. But the 24th offers the opposite of that. It pairs an enormous seismic event, a rare doublet of major earthquakes, with one of the mildest categories of solar storm there is. The mismatch is glaring. We are being asked to believe that a feather-light geomagnetic disturbance, the kind that happens routinely with no seismic consequence at all, somehow helped unleash 2 of the largest earthquakes of the year. That is not how triggers are supposed to work. A trigger proportionate to its effect would mean the great storms produce the great earthquakes, and the minor storms produce nothing. Instead, the proponents point to a minor storm beside a major quake, and call it confirmation. Keep that mismatch in mind, because it is one of the quiet cracks running through the whole edifice. And I will be honest with you, when you first lay that timeline out, it is genuinely arresting. It would be dishonest of me to pretend otherwise, to roll my eyes and tell you there is obviously nothing there. The solar wind doubled. Within the same window, 3 continents shook, 2 of them with the largest events of the entire week. If you were not already committed to a particular answer, and you simply looked at that sequence cold, you would feel the pull. You would want to know whether something connected them. That pull is real. And it is reasonable, and it is exactly why this question deserves more than a dismissive wave. So in the next part, we are going to meet the people making this argument directly, and hear their case in its strongest form before we ever lay a finger on it. Because to take a claim apart, honestly, you first have to build it up fairly, and the case for the sun moving the Earth is more interesting, and has deeper roots than most people realize. Part 5. The case that the sun pulls the trigger. The morning after the earthquakes, a widely followed voice in the online space weather community laid out the argument in its purest form, and it is worth hearing exactly as it was made, because it captures the hypothesis at its most confident. The claim went something like this. The solar wind amplification arrived in the evening universal time. After an earlier quake in California in the middle of the day, 3 big quakes struck the planet in the same hour. Japan with its 6.9 and the twin 7-pointers in Venezuela only 45 seconds apart, a very rare double event. And to this commentator, that lineup was not a curiosity. It was, in his words, an astrogeological confirmation of dozens of scientific papers on solar storms triggering earthquakes. The sun stormed, and the Earth answered, right on cue. This is not a fringe figure shouting into the void with no following. This is someone with a large, devoted audience who maintains an extensive library of videos specifically on the connection between solar activity and seismic activity, who references published research, including work he says he has co-authored on solar forcing of earthquakes. And his framing of the 24th of June was straightforward. The papers exist. The mechanism is real. And here, on this night, was a textbook example, a solar wind surge, then within the hour a cluster of major earthquakes including a rare doublet. For an audience already primed to see the sun as the hidden hand behind earthquakes, it was a powerful moment. It felt like watching a prediction come true in real time. I want to give this argument its full weight before we test it, because the worst thing a person can do, intellectually, is knock down a weak version of an idea and then congratulate themselves for winning. So let me build the strongest version of the solar earthquake case, the version that a thoughtful proponent would actually defend, not the cartoon version that is easy to mock. And the strongest version is more careful than the headlines suggest. It does not claim that the sun creates earthquakes out of nothing. It does not claim that a calm fault sitting comfortably below its breaking point suddenly ruptures because a solar storm came by. Even most serious proponents would tell you that is absurd. The strong version of the claim is narrower and, because it is narrower, much harder to dismiss. Here is that strong version. The Earth, at any given moment, has a number of faults around the world that are critically stressed. They are loaded almost to their breaking point by tectonics, sitting on a knife's edge, requiring only the smallest additional nudge to fail. They would fail eventually anyway, on their own, in days or weeks or years. The claim is not that the Sun loads these faults. The claim is that, for a fault already sitting on that knife's edge, a solar disturbance could provide the final tiny push that determines the exact moment of failure. The Sun, in this telling, is not the weight that breaks the branch. It is the last gust of wind that decides which second the already overloaded branch finally snaps. And if that is true, then a solar storm would not cause earthquakes everywhere. It would only seem to trigger the handful that were already right at the edge, ready to go. Do you see why that version is so much harder to argue with? It explains away the obvious objection before you can even raise it. If you say, but most solar storms are not followed by major earthquakes, the careful proponent answers, of course not, because most of the time there is no fault sitting exactly on the edge in the right moment. If you say, but most earthquakes happen with no solar storm at all, they answer of course, because the final push can come from many sources: a tide, a passing pressure system, the Earth's own restless adjustments, and the Sun is only one possible trigger among several. The strong version of the hypothesis is slippery precisely because it makes such a modest, hedged claim. It does not predict that the Sun will shake the Earth. It only claims that sometimes, when a fault was already going to break, the Sun might be what decides the timing. And that brings us right back to the question I told you to keep burning from part 2. What does it take to be the final push? Because notice something important. We have already met a final push in this very story, and it had nothing to do with the Sun. When the magnitude 7.2 near Yumare transferred its stress to the neighbouring fault segment and triggered the 7.5 38 seconds later, that was a final push. The first earthquake was the last gust that snapped the already overloaded branch of the second. So the idea that loaded faults can be tipped over the edge by a small external nudge is not exotic at all. It is mainstream earthquake physics. We see it constantly, in aftershock sequences, in the way one rupture triggers another, in the way even the gravitational tug of the moon can measurably influence the timing of certain small quakes on certain faults. The principle that a tiny trigger can set off an already loaded fault is real. The only question, the entire question, is whether the Sun's influence is large enough to be one of those triggers, or whether it is so vanishingly small that it gets lost beneath all the other forces acting on the crust. And this is where we have to talk about the actual mechanisms that proponents propose, because a hypothesis is only as good as the physical pathway it can point to. It is not enough to say the Sun and the Earth are connected by a feeling. You have to say how. By what physical chain does a disturbance in the solar wind, 93 million miles away, reach down and touch a fault 10 kilometers below Venezuela? Proponents have several candidate answers, and the commentator who framed the 24th pointed at one of them in particular. He argued that the dramatic geomagnetic storm, the aurora, and the magnetic rattling high above is not really the main event. The main event, he claimed, is in the lower ionosphere, the charged layer of the upper atmosphere, and its coupling down to the ground. In his framing, the solar wind surge disturbs that lower layer, and that disturbance is electrically and energetically linked to the surface in a way that can reach the faults below. That is one proposed pathway, the idea of ionosphere to ground coupling. But it is not the only one, and to be fair to the broader hypothesis, we should lay the others on the table too, because the serious literature on solar terrestrial coupling has explored several. There is the idea of geomagnetically induced currents, the notion that rapidly changing magnetic fields during a storm drive electrical currents through the conductive rock of the crust, and that these currents could subtly alter conditions along a fault, perhaps changing the behaviour of fluids in the pores of the rock that help control when it slips. There is the piezoelectric idea, building on the real fact that quartz, which is everywhere in the crust, generates electrical charge when it's squeezed, and asking whether external electromagnetic forcing could interact with the immense electrical stresses in strained, quartz-bearing rock. And there is the rotational idea, which leans on the genuinely established fact that the Earth's rotation speed fluctuates very slightly over time, and speculates that solar-driven changes in the upper atmosphere could nudge that rotation just enough to matter for the stress on faults. Each of these is a real proposed mechanism, and I am laying them out for you fairly because that is the only honest way to do this. The hypothesis is not empty. It points to actual physical phenomena, induced currents, piezoelectric effects, ionospheric coupling, rotational changes that genuinely exist. The question is never whether these phenomena are real. They are. The question is whether they are anywhere near strong enough to serve as that final push on a fault that is already at its breaking point, or whether they are so feeble compared to the colossal forces of tectonics that they vanish into the noise. That is the question we are going to put to the test in the next part. We have built the case for the Sun as fairly and as strongly as it can be built. Now we have to do the harder and more important thing. We have to ask whether it actually holds up, and to do that, we have to stop counting the times the Sun and the Earth lined up, and start counting all the times they did not. Part 6. Counting the silences. The single most important habit in all of science is also the hardest one for the human mind to practice. It is the discipline of counting the misses, not just the hits. Our brains are pattern-finding machines, beautifully, dangerously good at it. When two dramatic things happen close together, the solar wind doubling and the ground shaking, the mind does not calmly file it as a coincidence to be checked later. It lights up. It shouts, "Connection." That instinct kept our ancestors alive, teaching them which berries made them sick and which rustle in the grass meant a predator. But it also makes us terrible at telling a real pattern from an accident, because we remember every time the pattern held and quietly forget every time it did not. So let us do the thing the instinct hates. Let us count the silences. To believe that the solar storm helped trigger the earthquakes of the 24th, you cannot only look at the night the two lined up. You have to ask how often the sun storms without the earth shaking, and how often the earth shakes with no storm at all. And the moment you ask those questions, the case begins to come apart. Consider how common minor geomagnetic storms actually are. A G1 storm, the level we saw on the 24th, is not a rare event. Coronal holes rotate across the face of the sun roughly every 27 days, sending their high-speed streams past Earth again and again, and minor storms result many, many times every year. If a G1 storm were enough to help trigger a magnitude 7.5 doublet, then we would expect to see major earthquakes clustering around minor solar storms over and over as a clear, repeating, undeniable pattern. We do not. The overwhelming majority of G1 storms come and go with no major earthquake anywhere on the planet. Now run it the other direction. Major earthquakes happen all the time relative to a human sense of rarity. The planet produces something like 15 magnitude 7 events every year, and more than 100 magnitude 6 events. They strike during solar storms and during perfectly calm space weather, during the active years of the solar cycle and during the quiet ones, on the day side of the Earth facing the Sun and on the night side facing away. If the Sun were a meaningful trigger, you would expect a detectable lean, a tendency for big earthquakes to favour the times when space weather is disturbed. And researchers have looked. This is the crucial thing to understand. Scientists have actually run this test, taking decades of earthquake catalogues and decades of solar and geomagnetic data, and asking statistically whether earthquakes happen more often than chance during solar disturbances. And the result of that work, taken as a whole, is not a clean confirmation. It is, at best, a faint and contested signal that many careful studies fail to find at all, and that critics argue is an artifact of how the data is sliced. This is the honest state of the science, and I am not going to dress it up in either direction. There are published papers reporting statistical correlations between solar or geomagnetic activity and seismicity. They exist. The commentator who pointed to dozens of papers is not inventing them. But the existence of papers reporting an effect is not the same as the effect being real and established. In any large enough field with enough ways to slice the data, some studies will report a correlation by chance or by method, while others, looking at the same kind of question, find nothing. What matters is not whether some papers report an effect, but whether the effect survives rigorous, repeated, independent testing across large datasets. And the solar earthquake connection, after decades of people looking specifically because they wanted to find it, has not crossed that bar. It remains, in the mainstream assessment, unproven, with the weight of evidence pointing toward no meaningful causal link. And then there is the physics objection. which to my mind is even more damning than the statistics. Go back to the mechanisms we laid out: induced currents, ionospheric coupling, piezoelectric effects, rotational nudges. Every one of them, when you actually try to estimate the size of the force it could deliver to a fault, comes out staggeringly, almost laughably small compared to the forces already at work. The stresses that tectonics pile onto a fault over centuries are immense, measured in enormous units of pressure built up across kilometers of rock. The stress changes that a minor geomagnetic storm could plausibly induce in the deep crust are smaller by many orders of magnitude. We are not talking about a force that is a little weaker. We are talking about a force that is thousands or millions of times too feeble to compete. Asking it to be the final push on a magnitude 7.5 is like asking whether the breeze from a moth's wing can be the thing that finally topples a skyscraper that was already swaying. The skyscraper may indeed be about to fall, but the moth is not why. Here is the comparison that makes the point land. We talked about how even the moon can influence the timing of some earthquakes. That is true, and it is the closest real example of an external body nudging faults. But notice what the moon brings to the table. The moon raises tides, physically deforming the entire planet twice a day with a gravitational pull strong enough to move the oceans. And even that, even the genuine, enormous daily flexing of the whole Earth by the moon's gravity produces only a tiny detectable lean in the timing of certain small earthquakes on certain faults under the right conditions. It does not reliably trigger magnitude 7s, so if the moon's colossal tidal force can manage only a faint statistical whisper on small quakes, what are we to make of the claim that a minor disturbance in the solar wind carrying an almost immeasurably smaller mechanical punch set off two of the largest earthquakes of the year? The comparison answers itself. The sun's mechanical influence on the deep crust is far, far weaker than the moon's, and the moon can barely manage a whisper. But the most powerful argument against the solar trigger on the night of the 24th is sitting right there in the events themselves, and it is the detail I told you to file away back in part 2. The Venezuela earthquakes were strike-slip ruptures, two blocks of crust grinding sideways past each other on a continental plate boundary. The Japan earthquake 25 minutes later was a completely different beast. It happened in a subduction zone where the Pacific plate dives down beneath Japan, and it sat about 50 kilometers deep, far deeper than the shallow Venezuelan ruptures, on a fault driven by an entirely different mechanism. These two earthquakes had almost nothing in common geologically. Different plate boundaries, different fault types, different depths, different motions, different sides of the planet. Now ask yourself, how would a single solar trigger reach down and set off two such completely different faults, in completely different settings within 25 minutes, while leaving untouched the thousands of other stressed faults all over the world that did not rupture that night? A genuine external trigger, if it were strong enough to matter, should not be so wildly selective. The fact that the night's big quakes were so geologically unalike is not evidence of a common cause. It is the strongest possible evidence against one. There is a subtle statistical trap hiding inside this whole question, and it is worth dragging into the light, because it explains how sincere, intelligent people end up convinced of a connection that is not there. The trap is called selection, and it works like this. Imagine you are looking for a link between solar storms and earthquakes, and you have decades of data on both. There are countless ways to define your terms. How big does a storm have to be to count? How big an earthquake? How long is the window after a storm in which an earthquake counts as triggered? An hour, a day, 3 days, a week? Each of those choices is a knob you can turn, and there are so many combinations of settings that purely by chance, some combination will show an apparent correlation in any data set, even one with no real connection at all. If a researcher tries many combinations and reports only the ones that show a signal, they will produce a paper claiming a link, and the paper will be sincere, and the link will still be an illusion born of trying enough combinations. This is why the gold standard is not whether some analysis somewhere found an effect, but whether a single, pre-specified, rigorous test, applied honestly to the full data, finds one. And when that stricter standard is applied, the solar earthquake signal tends to evaporate. It also helps to understand the difference between a global claim and a local one, because proponents sometimes retreat from one to the other when pressed. The global claim is the dramatic one, that worldwide earthquake activity rises during solar storms. That claim has been tested extensively and does not hold up. The local claim is narrower, that some particular type of fault, in some particular setting, under some particular conditions, might show a faint sensitivity to some particular kind of solar or geomagnetic forcing. That narrower claim is harder to rule out completely, simply because it is so specific and so hedged, and there are corners of the research literature where weak contested hints of such effects have been reported. But notice what happens to the argument when it retreats to that corner. It can no longer explain the night of the 24th, because the 24th was not one special fault under special conditions. It was 3 completely different faults, on 3 continents, of 3 different types, all supposedly triggered by the same modest storm. The narrow claim that might survive scrutiny cannot carry the dramatic global event, and the dramatic global claim that could carry it does not survive scrutiny. The hypothesis cannot have it both ways, and on the 24th it needs both ways at once. And there is one more piece of evidence sitting in the data from that very night, quietly fatal to the idea that almost no one mentions. If the solar storm were reaching down and triggering critically stressed faults, then it should have triggered them everywhere the conditions were right, not just in 3 places. The Earth has at any moment many faults sitting near failure. A genuine planet-wide trigger strong enough to set off a magnitude 7.5 ought to have lit up loaded faults across the globe in a detectable surge, a worldwide jump in seismic activity during the hours of the storm. That is not what the catalogues show. The 7-day record around the event shows an ordinary count of earthquakes, the normal background drumbeat of a restless planet, with the major events of the 24th standing out as individually large but not as part of any global surge. If the sun were the trigger missed almost everything. It is hard to imagine a force that is simultaneously strong enough to break 2 great faults, and yet so selective that it ignores the thousands of other vulnerable ones. A coincidence has no such problem, because a coincidence is not trying to trigger anything at all. So when you put it all together, the statistics that refuse to cooperate, the mechanisms that are thousands of times too weak, the moon that can barely whisper, the 2 flagship earthquakes that share no geology at all, the careful conclusion is clear, even if it is not the dramatic one. The solar storm of the 24th of June almost certainly did not trigger the earthquakes. The timing that looks so compelling is what it most often is in a universe full of constant earthquakes and frequent solar storms. It is a coincidence, the kind that is bound to happen sooner or later, and that our pattern-hungry minds then seize on as meaning. That is not a thrilling answer. It does not promise us a warning system, but it has the considerable virtue of being almost certainly true. And yet, I am not going to leave it there, with a tidy debunk and a pat on the back, because that would be its own kind of dishonesty. Because the people drawn to this idea are not only reaching for a warning system, some of them are reaching for something much larger and much stranger, and we need to talk honestly about that too. Part 7. Where the Trail Goes Cold. There is a moment, when you follow the solar earthquake idea far enough, where the ground shifts under you, and you realize you have walked past the edge of a real scientific question and into something else entirely. And it is worth talking about that moment openly, because it is the key to understanding why mainstream science treats this whole area with such suspicion, and why that suspicion is, unfortunately, sometimes earned and sometimes overdone. The careful version of the solar trigger hypothesis, the one we built up so fairly, is a legitimate scientific question. People can and do study it with proper methods, and the answer so far is a fairly confident no, but it is the kind of no that science arrives at, honestly, by testing. That part is fine, that part is good. The trouble is what often travels alongside it, because the same communities that promote the solar earthquake connection frequently bundle it with claims that are not careful at all, claims that have left the realm of testable science altogether. The very commentator who framed the 24th of June, for instance, is also associated with predictions of an imminent reversal or collapse of the Earth's magnetic field, a coming pole shift framed as a civilization-ending event on a near-term schedule. There are associated ideas about the Sun producing a sudden catastrophic outburst, a so-called micronova, and about the need to prepare for survival through a coming cataclysm. There are even alternative models of the Sun itself being promoted in these circles, claims that the mainstream physics of the Sun's churning, convecting interior is simply wrong, that the solar surface is some kind of rigid, structured lattice, rather than the boiling plasma that every line of evidence supports. And I have to be plain with you about these. There is no good evidence for any of them. The mainstream understanding of the sun's interior is built on decades of observation, on the study of sound waves moving through the sun, on physics that successfully predicts what we see. The pole shift as an imminent doomsday, the micronova on a human timescale, the lattice sun. These are not findings. They are beliefs, and the evidence does not support them. I am not telling you this to mock anyone, and I want to be careful here, because contempt is lazy and it teaches you nothing. People are drawn to these ideas for understandable reasons. They offer a sense of hidden knowledge, of seeing what the experts supposedly miss, of having a warning when the official channels offer none. After a night like the 24th, when the ground kills without warning, and the authorities can only tell you where danger lives but never when it will strike, the appeal of a worldview that promises secret foreknowledge is powerful and human. I understand it. But understanding why a belief is appealing is a completely different thing from the belief being true. And the kindest thing I can do for you, the most respectful thing, is to tell you the truth as clearly as I can. The careful solar earthquake question is real, and the answer is probably no. The larger package of pole shifts and micronovas and lattice suns is not science, and you should hold on to your skepticism tightly when it is offered to you, alongside the real question. Because the presence of the real question is often used to lend credibility to the unreal ones. This is the trap, and it is worth naming directly so you can recognize it the next time you see it. You take a legitimate, open scientific question, the kind that has actual papers and actual researchers, and you stand right next to it while making far wilder claims, so that the credibility of the real question rubs off on the wild ones. A listener hears, there are dozens of peer-reviewed papers on solar effects on earthquakes, which is more or less true, and then in the next breath hears, and therefore the pole is about to flip and you need to prepare, which does not follow at all. The first statement is used as a passport for the second. Learning to separate those two things, to say yes, the modest question is real and unresolved, and no, that does not license the apocalypse, is one of the most valuable skills you can develop as someone who wants to understand the world without being manipulated by it. And it brings us right back to the central thread of this whole story. We are trying to figure out what actually warned us on the night of the 24th and what only pretended to. So let me bring the solar thread to its honest resting place before we return to the ground, because we have to hold two things at once, and holding two things at once is exactly what this channel is for. The first thing is that the sun, on the night of the 24th of June, almost certainly did not shake Venezuela. The timing was a coincidence, a dramatic one, the kind that a universe of constant earthquakes and frequent solar storms is bound to produce, and the physics and the statistics and the sheer geological mismatch between the Venezuela and Japan ruptures all point the same way. That is the conclusion the evidence supports, and I am not going to soften it to keep the mystery alive. The second thing, though, is that the question itself was not stupid to ask. The instinct that something connected that night was a reasonable instinct, badly applied. The error was not in noticing the coincidence. The error was in stopping there, at the hit, without counting the silences. And here is the part that I think actually matters most. The part that turns this from a debunk into something worth your time. The sun being innocent of this particular crime does not make the night of the 24th any less frightening. If anything, it makes it more so. Because if the sun had done it, then at least there would be a signal, a warning light in the sky we could learn to watch. The far more unsettling truth is that there was no such signal. The earthquakes came from the earth alone, from a loaded fault doing what loaded faults do on its own schedule, answerable to nothing we can currently see coming. The comfort of a solar trigger, if it were real, would be that the heavens announce the danger in advance. The discomfort of the real answer is that the danger announces nothing at all. It simply arrives. So we are left, after our long climb up to the sun and back, exactly where the ground left us at the end of part 3, but now we understand it more deeply. The most catastrophic earthquake in years struck a region that history had warned about for more than 2 centuries, on a fault that gave no short-term warning, and the dramatic celestial event that seemed to accompany it turns out to be a bystander, not a cause. The terrifying implication, it turns out, is not the one the title might have led you to expect. It is not that the sun is secretly shaking our world. The terrifying implication is quieter and harder to escape. It is that our world can do this to us, this catastrophically, this suddenly, with no external trigger to blame and no warning to read, any day it chooses. And before we close, there is one more place we have to look, because there is a second earthquake in this story we have mostly set aside, and it holds the final piece of the argument. We need to go to Japan, and we need to ask what the rest of the planet was doing while Venezuela burned. Part 8. The night the whole planet rang. While the rescuers were still pulling people from the rubble in northern Venezuela, the Earth was not finished. Roughly 25 minutes after the Venezuelan doublet on the far side of the planet, off the east coast of Honshu, the main island of Japan, a magnitude 6.9 earthquake struck the seafloor near the city of Kuji. And this one came with a danger the Venezuelan quakes did not carry. A tsunami warning was issued for the coast of northern Honshu, because this earthquake, unlike the strike-slip ruptures in Venezuela, happened in a place and in a way that can move the ocean. For the people along that coastline, the memory of what the sea can do to Japan is not history. It is a living generational fear, and the warning that went out that night landed on nerves that have every reason to be raw. To understand why Japan's earthquake was so different from Venezuela's, even though they happened within half an hour of each other, you have to understand where Japan sits. Japan is one of the most seismically tormented places on Earth, because it sits at a collision of plates, where the Pacific plate is diving down beneath the islands in what is called a subduction zone. This is the same kind of setting, the same fundamental machinery that produced the great Japanese disasters of recent memory. When we covered the monster earthquake that rocked Japan back in April, we walked through exactly this geometry: the descending slab, the locked interface, the way these subduction megathrusts store and release almost unimaginable amounts of energy and can shove the seafloor upward, displacing the ocean and sending tsunamis racing outward. The June earthquake near Kuji was smaller than that April event, and smaller than the Venezuela doublet, but it was born from this same dangerous subduction machinery, and that is why the sea entered the conversation the moment it struck. Now hold the two earthquakes side by side, because this is the comparison that quietly demolishes the idea of a shared solar trigger. In Venezuela, you had shallow strike-slip ruptures on a continental transform boundary, two blocks of crust sliding sideways past each other, only 10 to 20 kilometers down, generating no tsunami. In Japan, you had a deeper rupture around 50 kilometers down, in an oceanic subduction zone, with the kind of motion that threatens the sea. These are not variations on a theme. They are fundamentally different earthquakes, on different kinds of faults, at different depths, driven by different plate interactions, separated by thousands of kilometers and by the entire body of the planet. If you were designing a test to see whether a single external force could trigger earthquakes, you could hardly ask for two events less alike, and yet they fell within 25 minutes of each other. The proponent sees that closeness in time and reads connection. But the closeness in time, set against the total difference in geology, actually argues the opposite. A real common trigger would not reach across the planet to set off two utterly unrelated faults in different settings, while ignoring everything in between. Coincidence, on the other hand, does exactly that, because coincidence has no preferences. It does not care whether the faults match. And there was a third event, earlier in the day, that completes the picture. In the afternoon, universal time, hours before either Venezuela or Japan, Northern California had been struck by a magnitude 5.5 near the Mendocino region, on yet another kind of fault, the transform system of the western United States. So across the span of that single day, the planet produced 3 significant earthquakes, on 3 different continents, on 3 different kinds of fault, in 3 different tectonic settings. California in the afternoon, Venezuela's doublet in the late evening, Japan 25 minutes after that. To the eye looking for a pattern, this is the whole planet ringing like a struck bell, all at once, on the same day the sun stormed. It feels, viscerally, like too much to be chance, and that feeling is exactly the thing we have to examine, because feelings about probability are almost always wrong. So let us do the arithmetic that the feeling skips. How unusual is it, really, for the Earth to produce several significant earthquakes in a single day? The answer, which surprises almost everyone, is that it is not unusual at all. The planet averages something like 15 magnitude 7 earthquakes a year, and well over 100 in the magnitude 6 range. Spread across 365 days, that means significant earthquakes are happening constantly, somewhere, all the time. Most of them you never hear about, because they strike under the ocean, or far from cities, or in regions that rarely make the news. Days with multiple large earthquakes are a normal feature of a restless planet, not an anomaly that demands a special cause. We had covered this exact illusion before, when we looked at the so-called dangerous pattern of earthquakes forming across the planet, and found that what looks like an ominous global cluster is usually just the ordinary background drumbeat of a tectonically active world suddenly noticed all at once because the events happen to be large or close to people. The reason the 24th felt different is not that the Earth did something rare. It is that an unusually destructive event, the Venezuela doublet, drew the world's attention, and once your attention is fixed, you start noticing all the other earthquakes that on a normal day would pass you by. Japan's 6.9 on a day without Venezuela might have been a one-line item in the international news. California's 5.5 might not have reached you at all, but arriving on the same day as a catastrophe, and on the same day as a visible solar storm, they get swept into a single narrative, a story of a planet under siege from above. The narrative is compelling. It is also, almost certainly, an artifact of attention, not a signal of cause. The bell did not ring louder that day. We were simply listening because one of the strikes drew blood. This is the deep reason the solar earthquake idea is so hard to kill, and it is worth stating clearly because it is the same trap in a different costume. Any day you choose, the Earth is producing earthquakes and the Sun is doing something. On a quiet, space-weather day, the earthquakes still come, and you simply do not connect them to anything. On an active space-weather day, the earthquakes still come at their usual rate, but now there is a dramatic solar event to pin them to, and the mind eagerly makes the link. The earthquakes were going to happen either way. The Sun's activity was going to happen either way. The connection is manufactured after the fact by a brain that cannot help itself, stitching two independent streams of events into a single story, because a single story is so much more satisfying than two unrelated ones. The honest discipline is to remember that the streams are independent, and that on any given day some of their moments will line up by pure chance. It is worth dwelling for a moment on why the tsunami warning for Japan matters so much to this comparison, beyond the immediate danger it represented. A tsunami is generated when an earthquake physically moves the seafloor up or down, shoving the entire column of water above it, and sending that displacement racing outward as a wave. Strike-slip earthquakes, the sideways grinding kind that struck Venezuela, generally do not do this, because their motion is horizontal, and horizontal motion does not lift the sea. Subduction earthquakes, the kind that struck Japan, absolutely can, because their motion is vertical along the interface where one plate dives beneath another. So the simple fact that Japan got a tsunami warning and Venezuela did not is, all by itself, a direct readout of how different these two earthquakes were at the most basic physical level. They were not two examples of the same thing happening twice on one night. They were two fundamentally different kinds of rupture, and the sea knew the difference even if the headlines blurred them together. When a single explanation is offered for two events, and the two events behave so differently that one threatens the ocean and the other cannot, that explanation has a very heavy burden to carry, and the contrast runs deeper than the tsunami. Consider what would have to be true for a single solar disturbance to set off both of these earthquakes. It would have to reach a shallow continental strike-slip fault 10 kilometers beneath Venezuela and, at essentially the same time, reach a subduction interface 50 kilometers beneath the seafloor off Japan, two environments with completely different rock, different pressures, different temperatures, different fluid conditions, different stress orientations. A force that could nudge both of those wildly different systems over the edge within 25 minutes would have to be either extraordinarily strong enough to overwhelm the huge differences between the two settings, or extraordinarily lucky in finding both at the exact instant each was ready. We have already seen that the candidate solar forces are not strong. They are feeble, so we are left with luck, which is simply another word for coincidence, the very thing the hypothesis was invented to deny. The geological mismatch between Venezuela and Japan does not just weaken the solar explanation, it forces that explanation back into the arms of the coincidence it was trying to escape. There is a deeper lesson in this about how we consume news of disaster, and it is one worth carrying far beyond this particular night. When several calamities arrive together, the mind insists on a unifying story, a single cause that ties them into one meaningful event, because a single cause feels more comprehensible and somehow more manageable than the chaos of unrelated misfortunes piling up at once. But the universe is under no obligation to arrange its catastrophes into tidy narratives for our comfort. Sometimes a continent shakes, and a different continent shakes, and a storm blows off the sun, and they are simply three true things that happened on the same day, bound together by nothing but the calendar and our hunger for meaning. Learning to tolerate that, to let unrelated events be unrelated, is one of the quiet disciplines of seeing the world as it actually is, rather than as our storytelling minds would prefer it to be. So Japan, in the end, does not strengthen the case for the sun. It guts it. The very fact that the night's two great earthquakes were so geologically mismatched, a shallow continental strike slip in Venezuela and a deeper oceanic subduction quake in Japan, is the clearest possible sign that no single hand was moving them together. They were two independent expressions of a planet that is always, everywhere, under strain, and they happened to fall close in time on a day we happened to be watching the sky. And that brings us back one final time to the ground beneath Venezuela, and to the real lesson this night has been trying to teach us all along, a lesson that has nothing to do with the sun and everything to do with how fragile we are and how little warning we truly get. Part 9. What the doublet really reveals. Come back down to the ground with me, to the streets near Yumari in the first hours after the shaking stopped, because this is where the true meaning of the night lives. We have travelled all the way to the sun and back, and we have established that the sun did not do this. So now we have to face what did, and what it tells us about ourselves. And the first thing the Venezuela doublet reveals, the thing it screams, is how astonishingly fragile our built world is when the earth decides to move beneath it in earnest. Those buildings that came down were not flimsy by intention. They were homes, apartments, ordinary structures where ordinary families lived their lives, built the way buildings are built across much of the world, to stand against gravity and weather and time. They were not built to survive 2 magnitude 7 earthquakes 40 seconds apart, because almost nothing is. Let me make the near miss concrete, because gratitude requires understanding how close the alternative was. When the first images of collapsed buildings moved across the internet that night, the people watching, including those of us who follow these events for a living, felt genuine dread, because we know what a pancake multi-story building means. It means people are trapped inside in the worst possible way, with floors above them collapsed onto floors below. When you see several such collapses in a populated city, the historical math points toward a death toll in the thousands. That was the trajectory the night appeared to be on, and the reason it did not arrive there, the reason the reported toll by morning, while a real tragedy, had not climbed into those catastrophic numbers, comes down to a combination of factors that we should be honest about, some of them structural, some of them simply fortunate. The time of the event, the specific buildings that failed, and the many that held, the patterns of where people happened to be. The margin between this disaster and a far worse one was thin, and it was not made thin by any warning we gave. It was made thin by luck and by the limits of the rupture itself. That thinness should haunt us, because it will not always fall our way. The same fault system, the same San Sebastian and El Pilar boundary that runs beneath the great cities of northern Venezuela, is still there, still loaded, still moving a few centimetres a year, still capable of doing this again. And next time the variables that spared the worst this week, the timing, the luck, the specific buildings, could line up differently. This is the uncomfortable arithmetic of living on an active fault. The danger is not a one-time event that, having struck, is now spent. The plates keep moving, the strain keeps accumulating. The fault that failed this week will, in the fullness of geological time, fail again, and the cities are not going anywhere. They are built on the seam, and the seam is alive. And now I want to return to that phrase from the very beginning, we were warned, and show you how completely the meaning of it has transformed over the course of this story. When we started, you might have thought the warning in question was the solar one, the idea that the sun sent a signal in advance that we failed to heed. We have now seen that this reading does not hold. The sun did not warn us because the sun did not do it, but that does not empty the phrase of meaning. It fills it with a different, truer, and far more sobering meaning. We were warned, but the warning came from the earth and from history, not from the sky. We were warned in 1812, when this same fault family devastated Caracas and killed thousands. We were warned by every geological map that marks this plate boundary in the colours of high hazard. We were warned by the simple, knowable fact that two tectonic plates grind past each other directly beneath millions of people. The warning was there, in the rock and in the record, the entire time. We just cannot hold a warning that arrives once every couple of centuries in our collective attention, long enough for it to change what we build and how we prepare. This is the cruelty of the timescale mismatch, and it deserves to be sat with rather than rushed past. Human memory, human politics, human planning, all of it operates on the scale of years and decades. A career is 40 years, a news cycle is a day, an election is a few years away. But the great faults operate on the scale of centuries. A fault that produces a catastrophic earthquake once every 100 or 200 years is, from the perspective of any single human life, effectively silent. The people who experienced the last one are gone. The buildings that went up since were built by people who never felt the ground do this, and so each generation, in a sense, has to learn the lesson fresh, written in its own rubble, because the warning from the previous disaster faded out of living memory before it could be acted on. That is what happened in northern Venezuela. The warning was not missing. It was simply old, and we are not built to fear old things. There is a version of this story that I think is genuinely more useful than the solar one, and it is this. Stop looking up for a magic signal that will tell you the day, and start taking seriously the warnings we already have, which tell us the place. We know where the dangerous faults are. We have known for a long time. The Caribbean-South American boundary in northern Venezuela, the subduction zones around Japan, the transform faults of California, the great fault systems of Turkey, of the Himalayas, of Indonesia, of Chile. These are not mysteries. They are mapped, measured, understood. And the single most effective thing humanity has ever done to reduce earthquake deaths has nothing to do with prediction at all. It is preparation. It is building structures that can survive the shaking when it comes, because we cannot say when it will come, only that it will. The countries that have invested heavily in earthquake-resistant construction lose far fewer people when the ground moves than countries that have not, even when the earthquakes are comparable in size. That is the warning worth heeding. Not a signal in the solar wind, but the patient, unglamorous work of building for the earthquake we know is coming someday, on the fault we already know is there. And this reframes the whole emotional weight of the night. The temptation, when something this terrible happens, is to reach for an external villain, a hidden cause, a cosmic force that did this to us, because somehow that feels more bearable and more controllable than the truth. If the sun did it, then at least there is a single dramatic thing to watch and fear, and perhaps one day predict. But the truth is both more mundane and more demanding. The Earth did this, on its own, for reasons we fully understand, on a fault we had already mapped, with no warning we could read in advance because the kind of warning we want does not exist. And what that truth asks of us is not to watch the sky in dread. It asks us to do the hard, boring, life-saving work of preparing the places we already know are dangerous before the next time the ground decides to move. That is a harder message than blaming the sun. It is also the only one that has ever actually saved lives. But I told you the phrase we were warned is true in two different ways, and we have only fully unpacked the first. The first warning is the old one, from history and from the maps, the warning about the ground. There is a second warning, and this one is not old at all. This one is happening right now, this week, as I am speaking to you, and it is the one piece of this entire story where looking up at the sun is not a distraction, but exactly the right thing to do. Because while the solar storm of the 24th was a bystander to the earthquakes, there is something else on the sun, something that has nothing to do with shaking the ground, that genuinely does deserve our attention in the days ahead, and it is turning to face us as we speak. Part 10. The thing turning to face us. On the eastern edge of the sun's visible face, a giant is rotating into view. While everyone was watching the coronal hole and arguing about the earthquakes, the truly significant solar story of this week was quietly coming around the limb, and it is a sunspot region large enough and complex enough to deserve every bit of attention the earthquakes received. It carries the designation region 4478, and it is not an ordinary blemish on the sun. It covers an area of roughly 500 millionths of the solar disk. It contains around 20 individual spots, and most importantly, it carries the magnetic classification that solar physicists watch for above all others. It is what they call a beta-gamma-delta region, and that label is the closest thing solar weather has to a warning siren. Let me explain why that classification matters, because this is where looking at the sun stops being a distraction and becomes genuinely important. Sunspots are regions where the sun's magnetic field is concentrated and tangled. In a simple sunspot, the magnetic field has a clean structure, one area of north polarity, one of south, neatly separated, and such regions are relatively quiet. But in the most dangerous regions, the magnetic field becomes twisted and sheared, with opposite polarities crammed right up against each other in the same area, the configuration labelled with that Greek letter delta. When opposite magnetic fields are forced together like that, the region stores enormous magnetic energy under tremendous strain, and that energy can release suddenly and violently in the form of a solar flare and sometimes an accompanying eruption of billions of tons of solar material called a coronal mass ejection. A beta-gamma-delta region is a loaded gun, and the forecaster's numbers reflect it. For this region, the modelled odds run to roughly 95% for at least a minor flare, around 45% for a medium M-class flare, and about 10% for a major X-class flare, the most powerful category there is. Here is the detail that gives this a genuinely cinematic quality, and it is true, not embellished. We did not first see this region when it rotated around the edge of the sun. We saw it coming. A spacecraft positioned to observe the far side of the sun had been tracking this active region, while it was still hidden behind the limb, while it was literally on the back of the sun, out of view from Earth. So scientists knew, before it ever turned to face us, that something large was on its way around. The giant was announced in advance, and now it is arriving. As this region rotates further onto the Earth-facing side of the sun over the coming days, reaching a more direct alignment with us by the end of the weekend and into next week, any major flares or eruptions it produces become increasingly likely to be aimed in our direction, rather than off to the side. It already proved it can perform. Days before, while still near the edge, it let off a significant M-class flare, a magnitude 6.8 on the medium scale, a clear demonstration that this region is active and capable. The question now is what it does when it is pointed straight at us. This is the second meaning of "we were warned," and unlike the first, this one is unfolding in real time. With the earthquakes, the warning was old, a thing from history and maps that we failed to keep in mind. With this sunspot, the warning is fresh, specific, and based on solid, mainstream, well-understood physics. This is not the speculative, contested solar earthquake connection. This is the established, undisputed reality of space weather. We know beyond any argument that large flares and coronal mass ejections from magnetically complex regions can disrupt radio communications, degrade satellite operations, threaten power grids, and endanger astronauts and high-altitude flights. None of that is fringe. All of it is documented, expected, and planned for by the agencies whose job it is to forecast space weather. And right now, a region fully capable of producing those effects is turning to aim at our planet, and the forecasters are watching it closely, exactly as they should. So here is the irony at the centre of this entire story, and it is worth pausing on because it captures everything this channel tries to do. The solar event that everyone wanted to connect to the earthquakes, the coronal hole and its minor storm, was almost certainly a coincidence with no bearing on the ground at all. Meanwhile, the solar event that actually deserves our concern, this giant magnetically complex sunspot, has nothing to do with earthquakes whatsoever. The drama got attached to the wrong solar story. People reached for the exciting, unproven idea, this sun shaking the earth, and in doing so very nearly missed the real, grounded, important one, the sun preparing to throw genuine space weather directly at us. That is so often how it goes. The flashy speculation pulls the eye, while the solid, consequential truth sits quietly off to the side, waiting to be noticed. And the difference between the two is exactly the difference between the kind of warning that is worth your fear and the kind that is not. The solar earthquake claim offers a warning that feels enormous but does not hold up, a connection your mind wants to make but that the evidence does not support. The incoming sunspot offers a warning that sounds technical and undramatic but is completely real, a region that may, in the days ahead, send a flare or an eruption toward Earth with measurable consequences for the technology our civilization runs on. Learning to tell those two kinds of warning apart, the seductive one that is probably false and the modest one that is probably true, is perhaps the single most valuable thing you can take away from a night like the 24th of June. The sky did warn us this week. It just was not warning us about earthquakes. It was warning us about itself. To feel the weight of why this region deserves real attention, it helps to know what the worst solar events in history have actually done, because those are the upper bound of what a magnetically complex region is capable of. More than a century and a half ago, the sun produced an eruption so powerful that, when it struck the Earth, it set telegraph systems failing and sparking, with some operators reporting that they could disconnect their batteries and send messages on the electrical current the storm itself was inducing in the wires. Aurora were seen close to the equator, far from their usual polar home. That event happened in a world barely wired for electricity. If a storm of that magnitude struck today, the concern is not telegraphs. It is the continent-spanning power grids, the satellites that carry our communications and navigation, the systems that the modern world quietly depends on every hour of every day. This is not speculation from the fringe. It is the sober planning scenario that space weather agencies actively prepare for, precisely because they know magnetically complex regions can, on rare occasions, produce eruptions of that scale. I am not telling you Region 4478 is going to do that. The odds of any single region producing the largest class of event are low, and even its modelled chance of a major flare is well under half, with the most extreme category sitting at roughly 1 in 10. But that is exactly the right way to think about a real threat, in terms of honest probabilities rather than certainties or dismissals. A 1 in 10 chance of a major flare from a region turning to face us is not a reason to panic, and it is not a reason to ignore it either. It is a reason to watch, which is precisely what the forecasters are doing, and it stands in such sharp contrast to the earthquake claim. With the sunspot, we have a clearly defined region, a well-understood mechanism, a measurable probability, and a set of concrete documented consequences that we know how to prepare for. With the solar earthquake idea, we have a coincidence, a feeling, and a set of forces too weak to matter. One is the texture of real science, the other is the texture of a story we tell ourselves, and there is something almost poetic in a dark way about the timing of all this. In the very week that a community of people pointed at the sun and cried that it had shaken the earth, the sun was in fact doing something genuinely worth watching, something with real teeth, and it had nothing to do with earthquakes at all. The danger was real, and it was solar, and it was even, in a sense, foretold, since we had tracked this region coming around from the far side. But it was the wrong danger for the story people wanted to tell. They wanted the sun to be the hidden hand behind the rubble in Venezuela. The sun, indifferent to our narratives, was simply being the sun, building magnetic tension in a sunspot the way it has for billions of years, preparing to do what active regions do on its own schedule, for its own reasons, entirely unconnected to the ground that broke beneath Yumara. I do not want to overstate what this sunspot will do, because overstating it would be exactly the sin I have spent this whole video arguing against. It may produce major flares aimed our way, or it may quiet down as it crosses the disk. A 10% chance of an X-class flare is a real chance worth watching, but it is not a certainty, and even a major flare is not a doomsday. The point is not to frighten you about the sun. The point is that this, the careful tracking of a real, complex, active region as it turns toward Earth, is what genuine vigilance looks like, as opposed to the false vigilance of stitching earthquakes to coincidental storms. We will be watching Region 4478 in the days ahead, and if it does something significant, you will hear about it here, grounded in data, with the speculation clearly labelled and kept in its place. That is the promise. The real warnings get taken seriously. The false ones get examined honestly and set down. So we have found our 2 warnings, and they could not be more different from the one the night seemed to offer at first. One warning is ancient, written in the rubble of 1812, and in the maps of a fault that runs beneath sleeping cities, a warning about the ground that we are very bad at remembering. The other is immediate, written in the twisted magnetic field of a sunspot turning to face us right now, a warning about the sky that we are finally, with our spacecraft and our forecasters, learning to read in advance. Neither of them is the warning the coincidence of the 24th seemed to promise, and that gap between the warning we imagined and the warnings that are actually real is where the final lesson of this whole story is waiting. Part 11. Knowing where, never when. There is a single sentence that contains almost everything painful and everything hopeful about humanity's relationship with earthquakes, and it is this: we know where, but we cannot know when. Sit with both halves of that, because the whole story of the 24th of June lives in the tension between them. The where is not in doubt. We knew northern Venezuela was dangerous. We knew the fault was there. We knew Japan's subduction zone could move the sea. We knew California's transform faults were loaded. None of the locations that shook this week were surprises. Geologists could have pointed to every one of them on a map years in advance and labelled them hazardous, and they would have been exactly right. The where is, in a real sense, a solved problem. We have mapped the dangerous places of the Earth with remarkable thoroughness. It is the when that defeats us, and it defeats us completely. Despite a century of effort, despite the deepest desire of the entire field, there is no reliable way to predict the day or the week or even the year of a specific major earthquake. The strain builds invisibly. The fault gives no consistent readable signal in the days before it fails. And this is the gap that the solar earthquake hypothesis tries so hard to fill, which is precisely why it keeps coming back no matter how many times the evidence fails to support it. The promise of a solar trigger is the promise of a when, a signal in the sky that could finally tell us not just which faults are dangerous, but which night to brace for. I understand the hunger for that promise better than I can say. After a night like this one, the idea that we might have had a warning, if only we had been watching the right thing, is almost unbearably attractive. But a false warning is worse than no warning, because it sends you watching the sky while the real danger builds in the silence beneath your feet. So what do we actually do if we can know where but never when? The answer is not glamorous, and it will never trend, but it is the single greatest life-saving discovery in the history of living with earthquakes, and it is simply this: you build for the earthquake you cannot predict. You take the places you know are dangerous, and you construct them to survive the shaking whenever it finally comes. This is the entire philosophy behind earthquake-resistant engineering, and its results are not subtle. When a major earthquake strikes a region that has invested in resilient construction, with buildings designed to flex and hold rather than pancake, the death toll is often a small fraction of what the same-sized earthquake produces in a region that has not. The earthquake is the same, the geology is the same. The difference between thousands dead and dozens dead is, over and over again, the buildings, not the prediction, the preparation. This is why the framing of the night matters so much, and why I have spent so long insisting on getting the cause right. If you believe the sun shook Venezuela, then the lesson you take away is, watch the sun, wait for the signal, and that lesson will save no one, because the signal is not real. But if you accept the harder truth, that the Earth did this on its own, on a known fault with no warning we could read, then the lesson you take away is the one that actually works. Strengthen the places we know are dangerous. Build for the inevitable. Keep the old warnings, the 1812 warnings, the warnings written in the maps, alive in the decisions we make about how and where and what we construct, even across the generations when no living person remembers the last great shake. That is a lesson that bends the death toll downward. The solar story, however thrilling, bends nothing. And there is a quiet dignity in that harder truth if you let yourself see it. To accept that we cannot predict the day is not to surrender. It is to redirect our effort toward the thing we can actually control. We cannot stop the plates from moving. We cannot drain the strain from the faults. We cannot read the date of the next rupture in the solar wind or anywhere else. But we can decide what stands above those faults. We can decide whether the buildings hold. That power is real, it is proven, and it is entirely in our hands, and it does not require us to predict anything at all. In a strange way, giving up the fantasy of prediction frees us to invest fully in the reality of preparation. The communities that have made that trade, that have stopped waiting for a warning and started building as though the earthquake could come tomorrow, are the ones that survive when it finally does. Let me connect this back to the sun one last time, because the same principle applies up there, and it shows you what real vigilance looks like. We cannot predict the exact day a complex sunspot will unleash a major flare any more than we can predict an earthquake, but we have learned to do the solar equivalent of earthquake-resistant building. We track the dangerous regions, like the giant turning toward us this week. We harden our power grids against geomagnetic disturbance. We design satellites to weather solar storms. We give astronauts and airlines warnings when the radiation environment spikes. We prepare for the space weather we cannot precisely time, because we know the dangerous regions when we see them. That is the mature response to a universe that will not tell us when. Map the danger, respect it, and build to survive it. It works for the sun. It works for the ground. It is the only thing that has ever worked. So the real implication of the night of the 24th, the one earned by walking through all of this carefully rather than grabbing the first dramatic story that presented itself, is not that the sun is shaking our world. It is that our world is exactly as dangerous as the maps always said, that the danger arrives without the kind of warning we wish it gave, and that the only reliable shield we have ever found is to build for it in advance, in the places we already know. The Venezuela doublet was not a message from the sun. It was a message from the earth, repeating a message it has sent many times before, that we keep forgetting and having to relearn. We were warned. We are always warned. The warning is just never about the day, only ever about the place. And the question that should keep us up at night is not whether the sun will speak. It is whether we will finally listen to the ground. Part 12. The Ionosphere. Let me gather the whole night into one place, now that we have walked every part of it, because the picture that emerges is clearer and stranger than the one we started with. On the 24th of June, 2026, the planet produced one of the most catastrophic earthquake events in years, a rare double rupture near the cities of northern Venezuela. A magnitude 7.2 followed 38 seconds later by a magnitude 7.5, both shallow, both violent, both striking a region that history had warned about for more than 2 centuries. The same evening, Japan was shaken by a magnitude 6.9 from an entirely different kind of fault, and earlier that day California had been struck as well. And through all of it, the Earth was sitting inside a minor solar storm, a fast stream of solar wind from a coronal hole that had roughly doubled the wind speed in the very hours the ground was failing. To many, that overlap looked like the smoking gun in a decades-old argument that the sun shakes the Earth. We took that argument seriously. We built it up in its strongest form, the careful version that says the sun does not cause earthquakes, but might, for a fault already on the edge, provide the final push that sets the timing. We laid out the real mechanisms its proponents point to, the induced currents, the ionospheric coupling, the piezoelectric and rotational ideas. And then we did the hard thing, the thing the pattern-loving mind resists. We counted the silences. We noted that minor solar storms happen constantly without earthquakes, that earthquakes happen constantly without solar storms, that the careful statistical studies fail to find a robust signal, that the proposed forces are thousands of times too weak to compete with tectonics, that even the mighty moon can barely whisper to the faults, and that the night's 2 great earthquakes were so geologically mismatched that no single trigger could plausibly have moved them both. The verdict the evidence supports is not the thrilling one, but it is the honest one. The sun did not do this. The timing was a coincidence, the kind a restless planet and an active star are bound to produce. And we saw why that honest answer, far from being a letdown, is actually the more sobering conclusion. Because if the sun had done it, there would be a signal to watch, a warning light in the sky. The truth that the Earth did this alone, on its own schedule, answerable to nothing we can currently see coming, removes that comfort entirely. The terrifying implication of the night was never that the sun is secretly shaking our world. It is that our world can do this to us, this suddenly and this catastrophically, with no external trigger to blame and no short-term warning to read. The fault near Yuma gave no notice, it simply waited, the way these faults always wait, and then it let go, twice. But we also found that the night was not without real warnings, only that they were different from the one it seemed to offer. There was the ancient warning, written in the 1812 destruction of Caracas, and in every hazard map of the Caribbean plate boundary, a warning about the place, a warning we are tragically poor at remembering across the centuries between great earthquakes. And there was the immediate warning, the giant magnetically complex sunspot rotating to face us this very week, tracked across the far side of the sun before it even appeared, a genuine, grounded, well-understood space weather threat that has nothing to do with earthquakes and everything to do with the technology our civilization depends on. The sky did warn us this week. It just was not warning us about the ground. The 2 threads of this story, the earthquake and the sun, were real and important and worth every minute we spent on them, but they were never the single braided thing the coincidence made them appear to be. They were 2 separate warnings, each true, neither the one we first imagined. So what do you carry away from the night of the 24th of June? I hope it is this. The next time two dramatic things happen close together, and someone tells you one caused the other, remember the silences. Remember to ask how often the supposed cause happens with no effect, and how often the effect happens with no cause, because that question, more than any other, separates a real pattern from a comforting story. The instinct to connect is not a flaw to be ashamed of. It is the engine of curiosity, the thing that makes us look up and wonder in the first place. But left unchecked, it will stitch meaning into noise every time, and after a tragedy, when we are frightened and reaching for explanations, it will do so most powerfully of all. The discipline of checking that instinct, of demanding the silences be counted, is not coldness. It is the deepest form of respect for the truth, and for the people the truth actually serves. And here, at the end, is the thought I cannot shake, the one that ties the whole night together. We spend so much energy searching the heavens for a sign that will tell us when the ground will move, because the ground itself will not tell us, and that silence from beneath our feet is almost too much to bear. We want the sun to be the messenger, because a messenger means foreknowledge, and foreknowledge means control. But the more honest and more frightening reality is that we already have the only warning we are ever likely to get, and it is not in the sky at all. It is in the maps we have already drawn, the history we have already lived, the faults we have already named. The warning was never going to come the night before. It came centuries before, and it has been sitting in plain sight the entire time, waiting for us to be the kind of species that prepares for a danger it can see but cannot schedule. The Earth does not owe us a warning on the day. It already gave us the warning on the map. The catastrophe near Yumara was not a message from the sun, and it was not random, and it was not unforeseeable. It was the place doing exactly what the place was always going to do, on a night we could never have circled on a calendar, beneath a sky that happened, by pure chance, to be storming at the same time. We were warned. We are always warned. The only question that has ever mattered is whether, in the long quiet years between the shaking, when the danger feels like ancient history and the maps gather dust, we will have the wisdom to keep listening to the ground that gives us everything, and that will, one day, with no warning we want and every warning we already had, move again.